All right, so let's talk about the sea empires. This map is super cool. It's basically showing the like trade routes that existed in this time period. All of these things are connected, like we talk about the Columbian exchange and the silver flow and the globalized trade, and we're talking about the expansion of empire. But these things are part of the same story, So and this map I think really does show that. I think you can see here. So the red are the Spanish trade routes. So you can see where they're going. And then you can see the British trade routes coming into Canada and all the different colonies, right? So obviously, like the 13 colonies would have existed. And then the Dutch in green. So you can see the Dutch coming, from the Netherlands. Same thing. They're kind of going around the same paths, right? It's very similar, but it's also a little bit different. Just like the amount of trade that's happening in this time period is massive. Colonies were sort of like a means to an end, right? Like if I'm going to be going here often, or like if I can have a port right here, then it makes this like shipment of slaves a lot easier. So like I'm just going to show you a couple maps here just so you can see. In terms of like what do you need to know about each of these empires, I think the most important thing to know is just a couple of their colonies. Like know where they were influential. Other than that, you don't need to get super in depth on like who was in charge. So the Portuguese, obviously Portugal. Brazil would be like one of the biggest colonies of Portugal. So like they become independent in the 19th century, but Brazil is like a massive colony for Portugal. You also have got Angola and Mozambique, which would have been the two like most important African colonies for Portugal. There's also tons of different smaller colonies across India and Indonesia that the Portuguese have control of. For example, Goa in India still today is very Portuguese influence. The Spanish Empire is like the third largest empire in world history. The first one is the British Empire, which you'll see a map of in a second. The second one was the Mongols, which would have been the largest land-based empire, and then the Spanish. So like the Spanish have a ton of area, but then they've got a huge chunk of North America and all of Central America and the entire west coast of South America. This is where the Spanish were connecting to the Philippines for that, to then trade with China, trade with Japan. Spanish are everywhere, and what's fascinating about the Spanish and the Portuguese is like they're just like these massive empires in this time period, and then they just sort of like they lose a lot of power very quickly considering how big they were. Obviously by the end of this period, like most of this territory in the United States gets purchased as part of like the Louisiana Purchase. A lot of this area does. The Dutch are not as influential as the Portuguese and the Spanish, but they are really influential when it comes to the like joint stock companies. The VOC was like a massive joint stock company, which was basically like early form of crowdfunding, right? So instead of paying for my journey myself and colonizing this territory, let's pool our money together and go do it together. So if the ship sinks, we don't all lose. We all lose some, but we don't lose everything. So the Dutch, the most important place for the Dutch that you should keep in mind is Indonesia, which will then become independent in the 20th century. Don't spend too much time studying on the Dutch. Just know Indonesia, that was their territory. And then of course the British. I mean, you can kind of, it's easy to remember like who was a British colony because they speak English and oftentimes drive on the other side of the road, right? So the British just had so much territory. Australia, which became a penal colony later on, where they literally sent their prisoners to. India, which they'll take more control of in the 19th century, but have control of in this time period, have like a connection with. Burma, South Africa, tons of regions within Africa, Canada, the 13 colonies, obviously until the American Revolution, even some area in Antarctica. So like the British Empire is the largest empire that has ever existed. Obviously, so much of these lands have become independent, are independent today, are not part of the British Empire. The French. So where were the French? The French were mostly in West Africa, and same thing today. French is a widely spoken language in West Africa for this reason. They also have a huge chunk of North America, Canada, right? So like Quebec would speak French today, and Madagascar, parts of India, Vietnam. Vietnam is a big one because the independence of Vietnam is like a 30-year war in the 20th century. So we'll talk about that when we get to period 6.